I have so many questions. I just want to talk to the guy.
This is Alex.
While he was talking, I was just noting down points to ask about that. And then he would end and I'd have like 8 points and I'd have to decide.
And he's a massive dork.
It feels like that, but it's also incredibly open. It's not just, here is the atom, it is the building block of the universe, good night. It's very much like, here it is, have fun, go by.
Yeah,
Bye.
Go, just go.
And so am I, with good reason. Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking to Dr. Luis de Miranda, who has this entire theory of the way that we should live. He is a philosopher, he is a therapist, he is a novelist, he is just a really interesting man. And for this episode, I think we should just get straight into it.
Okay, it's nice to meet you, Louis. Could you introduce yourself? Just give us a rundown of who you are and what you're doing.
Right, that would be perhaps the most difficult question of the day. I've done a lot of things in my life. You know, I've started by writing novels because I thought that's the best way to change the world. Then I realized my novels were so philosophical and I was more interested in the ideas behind the stories than in the description of the landscapes that I indeed started writing philosophical essays, which, by the way, is also my training. I'm a philosopher by training. Much later, I did my PhD at the University of Edinburgh, actually. And so all my life is about, I think, applying my love for philosophy to my everyday life and the fact that I believe that we as humans are animals of meaning, and that physical health, psychological health are important, but that there's something that I call philosophical health that I think should be shared with everybody in order to allow them to have a more flourishing existence. So more concretely, recently, since now 3 years, I've opened a practice which I call the Philosophical Parlor, where I give philosophical counseling sessions to individuals of all really kinds, especially now with internet. I sometimes have patients in Bangladesh, for example. And so the reason why I decided to do that is that, well, despite the fact that I have a training in psychoanalysis, I never wanted to be a psychoanalyst because I believe that the role of philosophy is to allow people to connect to what I call the creal, basically absolute possibility, the sense that we can create our common conditions of life.
So you're going to hear a lot about what Louis calls the creal. And that's essentially because it's been his life's work. He's been working on this for yonks. But also because it's become his life view, and it's the way that he treats people. He treats his patients with this sort of philosophy. Now, this is probably the perfect time to tell you that this episode starts off very, very meta, and we ground it in stages. The creal, or the creative reel, is very abstract. However, in the latter half of the episode, we get to see how this concept is applied practically. So if you're sitting there right now thinking, what the hell is he talking about? I don't understand. That's 100% fair, but don't worry, because we get to it. He explains it. We're getting there. It's all good, friends.
Of life, rather than to fall into norms. And I think that many times, even in psychological therapy, there are a lot of norms being introduced and greeds that people follow, and what I want to do really is listen to people and help them reach their own integrity through this means that I think is intensely human, which is thinking, which for me is as important as breathing.
So a lot of things there. I would like to pick up on one of the first things you said before going deeper into the latter things. So what do you mean when you say philosophical health? I mean, it's very obvious what we mean by physical and mental health, but what do you mean when you say philosophical health?
Right. And so it's interesting because, first of all, you're right when you say it's obvious when we say physical health or psychological health. It was not obvious 200 years ago. The idea of physical health emerged in the 19th century and was slowly shifted from a community, a happy few of people who had access to gymnastics and training, to the fact that today, yes, it is considered almost a trope, something that even if you don't do it, you should do it. And it's sponsored by the state. There are programs of physical health. It has become part of our social reality. We could say the same thing for psychological health. No such thing existed before the end of the 19th century. And we know that, for example, Freud was one of those who introduced the idea. And again, in the beginning, it starts with a happy few, with a small minority of the population. And slowly over time, it became, again, a universal psychological man. So everyone now considers that, yes, psychological health is a sort of a condition a minima to have a good life. So my bet is that philosophical health can have the same evolution. Today, it's a luxury for the happy few, as it was, by the way, for the Greeks and the Romans, who had already a relationship to philosophical care of the soul, etc. But I believe that this paradigm is needed and needs to be democratized, in the sense, as I've said before, that people need to be allowed to be less dependent on what the community or the collectivity defines as real, the norm. So when we study philosophy, we start developing critical thinking and a form also of creative criticality, where we see many conventions that are taken as real, as natural. We see them as constructed, right, as conventions. And then we start seeing, oh, it's possible to do things otherwise. Well, this is the kind of training that I think would benefit any pop, just the people who study philosophy. Then I come up with, to answer more precisely, I came up with, and this is still work in progress, of course, but with what I call the 5 principles of philosophical health. The first one, I can list them first. So mental heroism, deep orientation, critical creativity, deep listening, and absolute possibility. And I suppose you can take them in different order, but so these 5 aspects are horizons of what I think can be part of a training towards a philosophically healthy life. Mental heroism means the fact that, well, indeed, courage is a virtue that is much needed if you want to have an authentic life. And many times you will experience moments where you might feel that you are alone against all. And sometimes it's needed. And of course, then this illusion dissipates and we realize, well, we're not that alone. This is a little bit connected. In my sessions, I sometimes use the Hegel's dialectic of the master and the slave. And I ask my patients, why do you think one becomes master and one becomes slave? And so I get a lot of very interesting responses. Just the fact of thinking about the question is itself, of course, an important process. But what I want to introduce to them and to have them grasp is the fact that, well, for Hegel, at least, you become master if you're ready to die for your ideals. And I think that we have lost a little bit this sense of, well, yeah, it's sometimes it takes sometimes a lot of courage. Integrity takes a lot of courage. Even of course, if we don't, I mean, we don't have to die necessarily all the time. We do something a little bit personal. Deep orientation is the fact that I believe that each of us has specific admirations, domains that we would like to cultivate more than others, certain values that we again admire and that we really would like to embody. And so deep orientation is the hypothesis that when we follow this sort of everyday endeavor towards what we admire, this actually helps us not only build more personal integrity, but also slowly create our social territory. Critical creativity, I think, is quite self-evident. Deep, it's also it's important here to have creativity with critical, because we've seen in the history of philosophy that excessive criticality might lead to dogmatism. I think the best example is communism in the 20th century. Communism, which might have started in the 19th century as an interesting ideal among other utopian ideals, became slowly a dogma, a critical dogma that didn't always allow new propositions. So critical creativity. Deep listening, also very easy to understand, very difficult to practice. So I'll give you an anecdote there also, just to be a little bit more concrete. One day I had a patient, and it's interesting because now I call my counselors, for a long time I call them counselors, but I decided to call them patient, to give really in the first meaning of patient. Because I think that in life, the good things come if you're patient. So it's really not in the clinical sense, but really in the sense that if you believe in slow growth, you're halfway there. And so one day, this woman, she was actually Indian, and she comes to my practice and tells me, I really don't know why I'm here. My life is perfect. And specifically, my big joy is to look at plants. I really like looking at plants, and specifically, I love looking at leaves. Leaves are so beautiful. The shape of the leaves, the color of the leaves, the way leaves grow. I could look at leaves forever. And then she pauses, and I look at her and I tell her, is there someone that you would like to leave? And she starts crying. Yes, my husband. So that's an illustration, quite nice illustration of what deep listening does. And that, of course, comes a little bit from my Lacanian training, where signifiers are very important. The different meanings of the words, etc. So, but deep listening is also important in our relationships, right? Here we're talking about philosophical health, so it's not necessarily in the context of a practice. It's also how we interact with each other and how we deal with our own life. And the last one is absolute possibility. And that connects with the cosmology I've been developing, which I call crealectics, and the axiom of the creel, which is my counter proposition to counter the philosophical concept of the real. And so, but we can enter into that if you think it's interesting. But
so we're about to get into Louis's big idea, but before we get there, there are terms that need explaining. The first is normative. When we talk about normative things, we are talking about should or should not. A normative statement would be, you should not put that puppy in the bin. It's a statement about the world that ought to be. It's like the moral ideal world. So, the second term is axiomatic, which means that something is self-evident or unquestionable. If you take something to be an axiom, then you take it to be a basic truth. Now, in maths and logic, axioms tend to be harmless, but an ethical axiom can be intensely problematic. And this is where normative statements come in. If you take a normative statement to be axiomatic, then it means that regardless of the situation, you should or should not do something. It becomes a rule. If your normative statement is, you shouldn't steal, and you take that to be an axiom, then basically you get the whole plot of Les Mis, where the poor guy ends up in jail because he stole a loaf of bread because he was starving, blah. Like, it's problematic. What Louis is about to explain is that it is our human predisposition to look for axioms. We want rules, and there's a good axiom, and he thinks he has it, and that axiom or rule, or however you like it, is absolute possibility. So when Louis says that he wants to challenge the philosophical concept of the real, the way that I interpret that is when we go about our daily lives, getting up at 7 a.m. to go to work, eating with knives and forks and never speaking ill of the dead, we perceive the way we live our lives as the real. And Louis wants to challenge that.
it's interesting, but to put it in simple terms is this idea that many often we are, by force of habit, we tend to be realistic. We tend to essentialize a lot of things that happen around us as being natural. Yeah, it's natural to wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning and take your car and go to work and come back at 7. Yeah, that's how things are. And so I believe that you can have an approach to help people be less normative. You can have an approach that is either ethical, axiomatic, or more based on a certain form of religiosity, or more precisely the fact that we humans, it seems like we really need to believe in a higher power of some sorts. But what philosophy and also political theory tells us is that, yes, even if it might be true that communities need to be organized around an absolute, we also see that this, and throughout history, that this absolute might lead to totalitarianism or dogmatism or different forms of oppression. So what I proposed is that, well, there is one absolute that perhaps, I believe so, but we can discuss it. There's one absolute that does not, that sort of self-destroys itself constantly and renews itself constantly, and it's creation. And actually artists have known that forever, and many process philosophers also, Bergson, Whitehead, etc. So I follow that trend, and I say, okay, so if we do need an absolute to function, let's say that creation is our absolute. Therefore, we would be open to difference and diversity, and therefore it functions also as an ethical and political ethical principle, in the sense that what we want is really to help people, train people to open their access to the field of possibilities, to open their domain of possibilities, and start almost by, because it's a training, right? It's something that we need to train almost as a muscle, to not have that mechanism of thought that it is not because things have been in such way until now that they need to be in the same way today or tomorrow. here, so that was the 5 principles.
That's very good.
Philosophical health.
There's a lot
Again,
to unpack there. So.
A lot. I want to start by asking. So when you say the absolute we need, I want to ask, why do we need an absolute? But that's the second question I'm going to ask. The first question I want to know is, when you say creation, what pops into your mind? What do you understand by creation?
Right. So for me, I call it the creel, right? So the reel with the sea of creation. I think that's you know, and in that sense, I might be an ancient philosopher, a cosmologist. I think that's what Aristotle's called the prime mover, or what the Greeks called physis, is this idea that, okay, the ultimate source of being is this flow of possibility, this flow of creativity, and so that's what I understand when I mean creation, as opposed to the industrialist version of creation, which is overproduction, which is we are on a planet that mostly
making stuff.
Yeah,
basically.
and it's a rock. Oh my God, panic. If we don't build a lot of stuff, if we don't overproduce a lot of stuff, then we will all die, right? And so I take the opposite stance. It's like we start from overabundance. It's just not visible, and it's just not necessarily material. And it's good that it's not all material.
So if I can repackage what you've just said, creation is basically the underpinning of our reality, by virtue of basically manifesting anything, any possible realm that is around us, and any possible state of affairs that can exist. Does that make sense? It started out making sense.
It's I just would edit the word manifesting, because this is a virtual realm. The creel is a virtual realm, mostly, but there's also, because there's the real in it, of course, so part of it gets manifested, but not all. And so philosophers, since Aristotle, Plato, but also Leibniz, Hegel, they actually spend their time discussing, okay, so how does this work? This passage from the potential to the real, right? And so, for example, notoriously, Leibniz had this idea of the compossible. So it's like not everything is possible at the same time. And so that's his idea of worlds, right? So a world is a set of actualized possibles that are compossible. They are possible together. But your definition was quite right. Apart from the fact that probably a very small I don't like to speak in percentages, but you know, a very small part of the creel gets actualized into the real.
So I think I want to bring it down even a step further. I'm hearing it as very open-minded, complete open-mindedness. This is what you see and this is what you perceive in the world, but knowing that it could have been totally different, but having that as your bedrock all the time, moving through the world knowing that that's always the case. Does that make sense?
Completely. It's an everyday meditation in a way. And it has been very beneficial for me, and so now I help people actually. And sometimes, you know, the funny thing is that this might seem abstract and very philosophical, but I speak about the creel with top managers of the multinational Vattenfall, and so I think that, in fact, if you take my experience of philosophical counseling, is like if you take any human being of any age, any social origin, in a room, and you start talking about the meaning of their life, there's always a connection. There's always and we get deep. So I think there is a lot of also of normativity in people not daring to understand, right? And then they read philosophy, oh my God, this is too complicated. I often say to people who are starting discovering philosophy, I always say, start reading the books as poetry. Don't try to, that works better with continental philosophy than with analytical philosophy, but don't try to understand everything. Just, you know, read it. Of course, it needs to be, take a book that feels, wow, this is, I don't understand everything, or I don't understand most of it, but it feels beautiful, right? And then there are moments that are epiphanies, moments of clarity, and it's a matter of confidence training, but also it's a matter of precisely opening ourselves to the strangeness, to the other, to the fact that not everything that is familiar is the best for us.
So obviously, me and Arianna have been brought up, or are being brought up, in the analytic tradition. So in my mind, when we say that every person or every human, when you get personal with them, or when you talk to them, they have an intuitive feeling, an understanding of the point of life, of their point of their life, and they can really discuss that. And then when we say that the normative understanding that people have may not allow them to understand the real, or to understand the realm of possibilities and the realm of authenticity that is possible within our lives. My intuitive reaction to all this is to search for a reason behind why have we come to this position where a lot of humanity struggles to, or why do we have the need for this philosophical health, which we obviously do. And the reason that I can think of, which is, I'm sure is wrong, is because we're basically stuck within a very small world. And I don't mean the earth and the universe, I mean our social world, where we are born. So if I'm born in a context where there's not a lot of progress in front of me, then I'm not sure I'm gonna start thinking about all of the possibilities that could have been, which I feel would make me depressed about the actual possibilities in front of me. So I would like to ask you, what do you think of that? What do you think is the reason behind this disparity between people understanding that there is a need of a point of value within their lives, and people ignoring that, and waking up and going to work and coming back waking up at 8 o'clock, going to work and coming back at 7 o'clock, and this is normal. We do that every day. What is your thought?
So, first of all, there are clearly inequalities that play a role in the fact that people might not even have the time or the cognitive disposition to go beyond worry, for example, or fear or anxiety. And so there are several reasons why a life world can feel totally shrinked. And of course, there are economical reasons, but we also, it's not the only explanation, because we also know people who have 2 cars, etc., and they are actually, their life world is also quite diminished. But I think what is important to distinguish is, at least in the work that I do, distinguish between possibilities in the sense that of what we can do in the physical world, and absolute possibility in the sense of a feeling, you know, the philosophical, but also sensitive and sensible openness to this emotion that it is possible, right? And so that's there's a little let's say a little metaphysical leap there, which is part of the training that that I do, of course, and that I offer. I think the reasons can be also anthropological, in the sense that we are collective animals, and from our birth we are trained into conventions and discourses that we feel we need to survive, right? A language, a certain cultural set of codes, etc. So, but we also, I think we also relate as human beings, and at least since the birth of the modern subject within modern nation state, with the idea of free will, right? Which is at least integrated politically as an ideal in the idea of human rights, etc. So, but you're right that there are many forces that tend to crystallize us, to sort of almost transform us into the robots of our own existence, cognitive robots.
That's a very, very good way of putting it, of crystallizing my thought into. I mean, how you described that was very good. I just wanted to compliment that.
Thank you.
So if I can continue from that and ask about, before we go into the underpinning of the absolute that we require, could I get you to describe the philosophical discourse that explains the absolute? So how do we know that we need that absolute?
Right. So for me, mainly it comes from my work on Lacan, and so Lacan has shown how we might be embedded in different discourses. By the way, not only Lacan but also Foucault, I would say, and in general the structuralists. So this idea that we belong to a more or less visible web of belief, a community of belief, and it might well be the case that the things that we might see outside of that cognitive frame are very few, right? We tend to adopt, or Bourdieu called it the habitus also. I'm just giving names here, not to name drop, but to help, people who are listening to me, if they want to look at some philosophy.
We will put in the description below some of the names and links.
Right. And so in my book, I wrote a book called, so in French it's Peut-on jouir du capitalisme, on Lacan, Heidegger, and Marx. And it's, in French, it works well because it works on the idea of jouissance, which is a Lacanian concept, which is over enjoyment or over joy. And so if you translate the title, Can We Enjoy Capitalism, is not as good, but still it's so. And for Lacan, there is this idea indeed that we, and the post-structuralist industrialists, this idea that there, at the core of our discourses, our web of belief, there is usually a totem, which is an invisible absolute that sort of holds everything together. And it could be, I mean, it's very simply in religion, it's God, but you have other discourses in which it is any form of fetish, right? Whether it's the capital, etc. And so it seems really a pertinent analysis on the fact that, well, when you look at so-called postmodernism, right? And the attempt, I would say, we could define postmodernism as the attempt by humanity to live without absolutes. I think it has failed tremendously. Postmodernism demonstrates that we need to live by absolutes, because in fact, we never got rid of absolutes, right? What postmodernism produced is that a sort of an explosion of communities, each living by their own absolute. And that's not necessarily bad in the sense that's what Chantal Mouffe calls agonistic pluralism. This idea that, well, fine, it's good that there is a diversity of communities, etc. But what we observe is that not only that communities live by an absolute or set of absolutes, is that they tend to want to impose it to the others. And I would say that's a natural, I mean, I take it as a natural phenomenon. I don't try to change that. So whenever there is an organized community, I know they will want to expand. And I don't think it's useful there to say, okay, what are the nice communities and what are the bad communities? I put everything everyone in the same bag. And I say, okay, that's fine. So in that case, we need, if we agree, and of course it needs more elaboration than what I said, but if we agree that, okay, humans tend to form communities organized around an absolute, if we agree on that, then what we want to do, and if we agree also that they tend to want to expand and conquer, if we agree on these two premises, then the only thing to do is say, okay, so we need to find an absolute that would be a shared cosmology, a global social contract, in which this absolute actually prevents all the other ones from becoming totalitarian. And hence my idea that, well, I think it's creation, or what I call the creel, as a sort of a ethico-political ground for a global social contract, which I think we need desperately today. I think that's the idea there, that it's somehow connected to your point, Alexandros, when you talked about religion or belief, is that I do think that we as human beings need a connection with the sublime. We need a connection to what is beyond the real. And that is that is part of the ecology of our mind, and I take that seriously. So instead of trying to to accept the fact that, oh, we can live in a relativistic world where we only believe in physicalist hypotheses and the fact that everything is matter, I'd rather take seriously the human need for the sublime. And then the question is, since the sublime, Lacan would say, in French we say chasser le naturel, il revient au galop. If you try to evacuate what is natural, it will come back through another gate. And we could say, if you try to evacuate the absolute, it will come back in a way that perhaps you don't want to, in an ugly way. So it's better to have, and it's interesting because in history, you have already several attempts to sort of implement the cosmological absolute into politics, and that started with Plato, right? Who was not very successful, but he was the counselor of what was called at that time a tyrant, but it was like the governor of a city, and he tried to implement philosophical principles to it. So there is a history, not always very successful, of trying to apply philosophical insights to politics. But I think we should continue to try that.
So I have more of a question about the people that you would be helping with all of this, because I think it's really interesting. And Alex and I were actually talking about this yesterday. People, or at least people as I view them, quite like having anchors. They like having things to hold on to, and they're like, okay, I can put my self-identity here, and this is what's right and wrong, and they have all of this. And if I'm interpreting you right,
your only anchor and the main anchor, the only absolute, is the creel, the creation, the creativity. But I wonder, and I wonder whether it's something you encounter often. I feel like if I were sitting in the therapist chair and hearing all of this and going, oh, there's quite a lot of possibilities. Do you get people that kind of go, oh, the world has just kind of exploded in front of me, and now I have no idea what I'm doing. This is such a big idea, and I'm quite scared. Does that happen?
So first of all, I try not to lecture people in my sessions. So I listen a lot. And my idea is not to, usually what I do is that I don't present them with my worldview and crealectics in the beginning. And sometimes I probably end up out of honesty to do it just because that's my frame, but it's not the main point. I think the main point is really understand why they might be stuck and how they could expand their domain of possibility. And I'll give you an example, because you were talking about this belief that we carry as defining our identity. And so today you have a lot people who identify themselves with a diagnose. It's the case in Sweden, but I believe it's the case in the US, also in many other Western countries. And so they come to me and they say, well, I'm bipolar 2. Therefore, I can't do this, I can't do that. Or I'm ADHD. I was diagnosed when I was 13, and therefore I'm no good, right? And so, but the first work that I do is that I actually de-diagnose people. Honestly, people who come to me, they don't have this heavy psychiatric case, because I suppose just the fact that it's called the philosophical parlor. So for example, one thing I can do is, okay, so you're saying you are bipolar 2. Can you explain to me where it is? So I pretend I don't know anything about it, and then they explain to me. I remember this young man, and he said, well, sometimes I get really excited about an idea I have, and sometimes I get really depressed, and then I say, well, in the 19th century, that was called the artistic type. So I try to bring them to the idea that that's the human experience, right? And the fact that it was diagnosed then actually contributes to making it a mechanism, and actually it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Another case of also a young person, and he was diagnosed ADHD quite young, and he had the idea, well, I cannot focus, and therefore I don't really have a good job. I work with computers, he took a lot of medication. And so it took a few sessions, but after a few sessions, he stopped his medication, and actually he realized, I helped him realize that there was a domain where actually he was focusing a lot. He was drawing. He was drawing a lot. He was drawing sometimes 2 hours a day, but he was not even conscious. When I'm drawing, I'm actually focusing, right? And so, just to give you an example of how this progress went, in 10 sessions, he was able to stop his medication, stop believing that he was no good because he was ADHD. I have a much more independent, autonomous take on his life, quite the existentialist view, that we might have such and such different pasts that are more or less lucky, but believing that what we are now is a result of the past, that's what Jean-Paul Sartre called bad faith. Precisely if it is helped to say, okay, therefore I cannot do this. And so in the end, what happened is that he became a tattoo artist because he realized that his drawings were, you know, quite symbolic, and that it was actually fascinating. So he started a tattoo course, and so that's the kind of examples of people that I work with. But my practice is not really about indoctrinating them about the crealectic, or maybe that's my secret agenda, right? But but it's more really, and I'm also, because it's more interesting when you help people, you listen, and you are ready also to be surprised and to discover new forms of life, new forms of being.
It sounds to me that your job is basically a different iteration of friendship. So you're taking the role of a friend and of how a friend is supposed to be, I guess, who listens, understands the situation, and then makes suggestions as to how or why a person should do something. So the question I have is, why is it that in many cases our friends don't do this, and we need a trained professional to step in and help us with this? So do we have the capacity to be friends to other people like that in our individual lives? Do we not have that capacity? And if we do have that capacity, why is it that we don't do it at the moment? If you think we don't do it at the moment.
Well, that's a good point. And as you know, of course, philosophy is the friendship with knowledge, right? So it starts with discussions among friends. However, I don't see necessarily myself as a friend in all the senses of friend. I see myself as a philosophical friend, but not necessarily, for example, as an emotional friend, for example. Or even if I may have some form of empathy, but I think, so in certain cases, I might, in some moments, say some things that are not expected and that are not nice, while friends, because they have this role that needs to be both emotional, etc., they might actually have the wrong kind of empathy. Sometimes empathy, does more harm than good if you're trying just to say, yeah, you're right all the time just because it's a friend. Or, of course, then one could say, well, that's not a good friend, right? But so I think that what I would say is that what I try to establish is a friendship of the person with herself. That's the first thing. So, and I think that's why people might feel and it's true, you're right. In some cases, I can feel that people, they like to talk to me, but at the same time, that might be when there's too much comfort in a conversation. That might be also like a routine. And there are some cases where the person likes so much to come once a week and talk to me that she or he might not progress, right? And then I have to break a little bit this idea that I am the friend. So yeah, I think the most important is like reconcile people with themselves. And that's where I can get very, very simple and say, what I do is about teaching people not only to love themselves, but to do what they love. And that sounds like such a cliche, right? But I think that if I say it now, after all I said, it takes another dimension. That if you really do what you love on an everyday basis, little by little, with this idea of slow growth and care, then miracles happen.
I'm going to ask a really bizarre question, but have you ever seen RuPaul's Drag Race?
Is that a person?
Yeah, it's a TV show about drag queens that have a massive competition. But RuPaul has a very similar philosophy about how you treat yourself. Obviously, she says it with a lot more makeup and wigs and everything, but
Right.
basically it's the, if you can't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love somebody else? And that whole philosophy. There's also a lot more slapping involved and just making people sew things that are really difficult, but it was essentially, I think it comes down to the same thing, where she was like, the idea is that if you're wanting to succeed and do well in what you want to do, the biggest problem is your own inner saboteur, is what she calls it. And that's always going to be your biggest problem, even if it does feel, like you said earlier, as if like the whole world is against you.
Yeah, self-sabotage is indeed, by the way, I like the slapping idea. It sounds very Nietzschean to me. But self-sabotage is important, and I think one aspect towards the healing of that is also to understand that it might not necessarily always be the self that sabotages itself, but internalized versions of authority that we carry and that are not visible as such as voodoo, but they are not necessarily ourselves, right? So I think, and there we are at the very origins of the practice of philosophy as care, which is answering the question, who am I? Or the famous Delphi oracle, right? Know yourself.
So if I can put that question to you, who are we? How do you understand the self? How do we understand our individual existence from inside, I guess?
Right. I think we are a subjective being in dialogue with the Creole. And that's how our presence in the world is to find our mission in this harmonious dialogue with the Creole. And a lot of the suffering comes from the fact that we turn that off. And then we become invaded by things that are not sublime. And we suffer because they're not sublime. And we think we suffer because of them. But of course, but that's also because we turned off our dialogue with the Creole as what really counts. As you can hear, my voice is, I think I can take it more like maybe 5-10 minutes, and then I will
That's absolutely
conclude.
fine. It's been absolutely fascinating. I think my question, and maybe one that we can round everything off on, is just how did you get to this point? You obviously were born and you were living, and then you decided to study philosophy and you wrote books. Like, what was that journey like for you? Were there points at which you were like, I have no idea what I'm doing?
No, that's a beautiful question too. You guys have good questions. You know, I think I will not retell my entire life, but I remember being 20, being a student in philosophy, and being quite depressed. First of all, because studying philosophy was considered like a disease and also a social failure, right? You're not going to have a job, and probably you're studying philosophy because there's something wrong with you, right? And I felt the opposite. I felt that my discovery with philosophy was really the key to my resilience, and that it really helped me make sense of things and become more in creative control of my integrity. And so, and it was difficult because even, I have to say that even my parents were not supportive. My father was quite against the fact that I studied philosophy. And so, of course, the parents, they always communicate their fear, right? So but you know, I decided I was right, and I decided that the way I saw philosophy was the right way. And so I slowly, while keep remaining faithful to that vision, I slowly and not always easily try to, you know, make a living out of this, but make a living in all the senses of making a living. So it was not a self-evident nor easy path, but I think it was worth it, and I think that's also what I try to convey and to transmit. And there, perhaps the image is not that much the image of a friend, but perhaps the image of a mentor of some sort, is that I try to, you know, to convey to people, you know, if you're brave, it's possible. If you work hard, but also the work is the easiest part, because, you know, it's just amount of hours and focus, etc. The hard part is belief, right? The belief in yourself, and then the fact that the vision that you have will lead somewhere, and not be invaded by the realistic common fears that are shared and propagated like a virus around us.
Right. So I've thought of one. Have you learned anything new the past year? And if I can expand this a bit more, have you learned, or do you normally learn anything new from your counseling sessions? So is it a learning experience for you?
Yeah, I can answer on 2 points. The first one I would call synchronicity, and the first one is humanity. So what do I mean by humanity? Well, previously I was not necessarily the model of empathy, let's say. I was more like the typical philosopher who is quite self-sufficient, autonomous, and who actually can spend a lot of time alone and writing my books, etc. And so one thing I've learned is that first of all, I've learned for myself that I could care for my fellow humans in the sense systematic, right? We can also care occasionally, but it takes some sort of, it's a difficult job to listen. I cannot usually do more than 4 consultations a day, and I actually, because I'm also a researcher at Uppsala University, so I only do consultations, you know, I have maybe 5-6 every week, or a little bit more sometimes. But and so, but now with the virus, etc., I have more people online from all over the world, as I was saying. And one of the things I discovered, for example, the other day, it was a young man in Bangladesh. One thing that I have learned is that we because there is this abstract humanism that says we are all the same, but sometimes it's a bit abstract, like, but now I've experienced it. In fact, we are all the same. Like I speak with people from so many different cultures, and in terms of the meaning of our life or what we want to do with our life, we are so similar, and that's beautiful, I think.
It is.
And what I mean by synchronicity, and that, of course, is a term that comes from Jung and his own experience of therapy. But I did notice something strange, is that, you know, you're probably like me, that especially if you have a philosophically oriented mind, we are constantly thinking about things, or at least so. And so my philosophical work has a progression, and I'm thinking, so some weeks I might thinking about such concept, and I noticed that there seems to be a sort of harmony of like almost a collective brain with my patients, is that sometimes they bring topics that are precisely the topics that I'm I'm thinking about before I even mentioned it. So those two things are very nice and surprising.
You said we had good questions. I think you have better answers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks a lot.
But
don't. Yeah, I mean, if you want, in a few months, we can do that again, and take new angles, new dimensions. I'd love to.
Yeah, I think that would be amazing. Yeah. No, it's been lovely. It's like a taster session, and you're like, oh, this is also exciting. Yeah,
Great.
Lots of things to think about. I have one tiny quick question, which is, do you think that you'll start expanding the philosophical parlor? Do you think you'll start taking on people to train them to be counselors as well? Is that something that you would look to do?
Yeah, that's a good question.
So, well, it's perhaps not at the moment. I would say that I think that people, it's not mature enough to have it as a full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
So now, because I'm also a researcher at the university, and because I've pre-electized the fact that what I do at the university theoretically is the theory of philosophical practice and philosophical health, I'm building this network. I have this site, philosophical.health, and building this informal international network. You're welcome to join it. At the moment, it's just a sort of a huge scroll down of people who believe it's a good idea to start thinking about philosophical health. But I'm also doing more precise work with researchers. Also with we didn't talk about that, but I'm starting to work with a doctor here who works in neurorehabilitation with people who have spinal cord injury. And so when you have spinal cord injury, you might be paralyzed but have perfect mastery of your brain function. So you need to reinvent your entire life. And so we're going to work together, because he's convinced that what people need in neurorehabilitation is not only to learn how to use a wheelchair or stuff, but they have to reinvent their entire life world. So they need philosophy. So that's another aspect. But I do think that this is moving forward. This is slowly expanding, and I'd be happy to train people. I'm not the only philosophical counselor in the world. The movement has started sporadically since the 80s, but it's not very organized and it's under theorized. So what I want to do really is to elevate it to academic dignity, but also I said that, oh yeah, because you have the people only have the sound. So I made a sign which showed that this was a little bit ironical, but it's only half ironical, and also through the practice and through training, and so then the question is it philosophers who would be trained in order to do this work, either with in different setups, institutions, corporations, hospitals, or do we train people inside institutions to have a more philosophical approach, like nurses, for example? So my preference here would be to train young philosophers, because then I would work against this idea, and unfortunately often reality, that studying philosophy doesn't lead to a real job. So if I can do something in terms against that, and to give jobs to meaningful jobs to young philosophers, I'd be happy to. And that's, I mean, I don't say that jokingly. I think that there should be a program. There should be a university program. There should be a training program. It's really useful, helpful, and there's a place for philosophical health practitioners in different parts of society today.
That's
It sounds
great.
amazing. 100% on board.
So welcome.
Cool. Thank
Okay.
you so much for coming on the show and for talking to us.
Yes, well, thank you.
We've had a great time.
And good luck with your show. It's a great show.
Thank you.
And yeah, and well, let's talk soon.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Luis de Miranda, courtesy of his name, much like Ben van Loon, is a very easy man to find. If you are interested in learning more about him, we pop some links in the description. Next week, we are going to be talking to Francis Brewer. We're going to be talking to him about thinking your mum might be crazy and changing your mind, veganism, and how to be the most persuasive person in the room. We're on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and there's still talk of the TikTok, so here's hoping. I've been Arianna, and you've been gorgeous, and this is Escaping the Ivory Tower. Also, thanks, Alex.
Oh, are we putting all of these on? Oh, I was not aware of that.
Well, I mean,
okay.
like, I'll edit,
that's
but like...
no. I mean, even an editor, I think it might be a good idea to